You know what's strange about the way we talk about money? We talk endlessly about tactics, how to invest, how to save, how to optimize returns. But we almost never talk about why people behave the way they do with money in the first place. And that's why one generation keeps confusing everyone. They save aggressively, sometimes obsessively, yet they spend freely on experiences. They earn solid incomes, yet live as if one bad month could knock everything over. From the outside, it looks irrational, even self-contradictory. But it isn't. That generation is Gen X. And when you look closely, their money habits aren't about spreadsheets or strategy. They're about memory. They're about fear. They're about what their nervous system learned long before they ever opened a brokerage account. Gen X didn't develop a money mindset. They developed a survival response. And once you see that, everything they do with money suddenly makes sense. To understand Gen X's money mindset, you have to rewind to the promise they grew up with. Gen X didn't invent the rules, they inherited them. As kids, they watched their parents follow a very clear formula. One company, one paycheck, one career path that moved in a straight line. You stayed long enough, and the company stayed loyal back. The bank teller knew your father's name. The mortgage had a finish line you could actually point to on a calendar. Pensions weren't a myth, they were a guarantee. The message was simple and repeated everywhere in American life. Work hard, be responsible, stay loyal, and the system will take care of you. For a while, it looked true. Then the ground shifted. Not gradually, not politely. Factories closed. Corporate restructuring became normal. Lifetime employment quietly disappeared without a press release. And then came 2008, the moment when the system didn't just wobble, it collapsed in public. Gen X watched neighbors lose homes. They watched retirement accounts get cut in half. They watched parents with 20 years of loyalty walk out of office buildings carrying cardboard boxes. No warning, no safety net, no dignity. That wasn't just an economic event, it was a psychological one. Because when you grow up believing in a contract and then watch it get torn up, you don't just lose money, you lose trust. And that moment burned one lesson deep into Gen X's nervous system. Never depend on a single source of income. Never assume stability is real. Never let your survival rest in someone else's hands. That belief didn't come from ambition. It came from fear. After that trust was broken, Gen X adapted. Not loudly, not dramatically, structurally. They kept the day job. They showed up. They played the game. But underneath, something had changed. Gen X doesn't see a job as an identity. They see it as a dependency risk. So while the paycheck came from one place, the escape routes didn't. A rental property on the side, a consulting gig after hours, a small business that started in a garage or a spare bedroom, a side income that didn't care whether a boss got tired of you or a department got cut. To outsiders, this looked like hustle culture before hustle culture had a name. But that's not what it was. This wasn't about chasing upside. It was about avoiding captivity. Gen X watched what happens when your income has a single point of failure. They saw how fast secure employment turns into a locked door and an HR meeting. So they diversified income the way a trauma survivor scans exits in a room. Not because they expect disaster every day, but because they never want to be trapped when it comes. That's the pattern most people miss. Gen X isn't building side income because they're greedy or hyper-ambitious. They're building it because freedom feels safer than loyalty ever did. That same break in trust reshaped how Gen X thinks about saving. On paper, Gen X looks disciplined. They contribute. They're consistent. They do what the books say you're supposed to do. But emotionally, their relationship with saving is very different from other generations. They don't save because they believe everything will work out. They save because they don't. Gen X watched retirement accounts shrink in real time. They watched safe portfolios evaporate during market crashes. They learned, painfully, that numbers on a statement are not the same as certainty. So they adapted again. Saving became defensive, not a tool for getting rich, not a bet on a comfortable future, but a buffer against being cornered. To Gen X, savings isn't hope, it's leverage. It's what allows you to say no, to walk away from a bad boss, to survive a layoff without panic, to avoid making desperate decisions under pressure. That's why so many Gen X savers still feel anxious. From the outside, they have enough. From the inside, enough has never felt permanent. Because once you've watched the floor disappear, you stop assuming it exists. Saving, for Gen X, isn't optimism. It's armor. Gen X's relationship with debt is often misunderstood. People assume they're either conservative or old school, that they simply don't like borrowing. That's not quite true. Gen X doesn't hate debt, they hate chaos. They're perfectly willing to take on a mortgage. Why? Because a mortgage has structure. It has rules, a schedule, a clear monthly obligation, and, most importantly, an ending. You can see the finish line. But revolving debt is different. Credit cards, open-ended balances, minimum payments that barely move the needle. That's quicksand. Gen X watched their parents sink into it. They saw how a few bad months turned into years of stress, how interest compounded faster than income ever could. And they learned a simple rule that stuck for life. If you can't see the end of the debt, don't touch it. This was never about good debt versus bad debt. That language came later. For Gen X, debt was about control. Fixed obligations felt manageable. Floating ones felt dangerous. Because when the system is unstable, predictability becomes a form of safety. This is the part that confuses people the most. Gen X saves defensively. They avoid chaotic debt. They diversify income. And yet, they spend freely on experiences. Concerts, travel, live events, moments that, on paper, look non-essential. So what's going on? The answer is trust. Gen X doesn't fully trust things. They've seen houses go underwater. They've seen cars lose half their value overnight. They've watched possessions turn into liabilities when the economy turns. They learned that ownership isn't the same as security. But experiences are different. No one can repossess a memory. No market crash can devalue the night you felt alive. No policy change can erase the trip that changed how you see the world. When systems feel unstable, permanence moves inward. So Gen X shifted their definition of wealth, not toward what can be owned, but toward what can't be taken. In a world where assets failed them, experiences became the safest investment they knew. Not because they were careless, but because memories felt more reliable than markets. Gen X has a complicated relationship with financial advice. They listen, but cautiously. They learn, but skeptically. And it's not because they think they're smarter than everyone else. It's because they watched experts fail in real time. They saw their parents hand over money to professionals, advisors, institutions, people with credentials, confidence, and clean brochures. And then they watched control disappear. Retirement plans underperformed. Safe strategies collapsed. Decisions were made somewhere else, by someone they never met. That experience left a mark. So Gen X internalized another rule. If I don't understand it, I don't trust it. That's why they read obsessively, why they build spreadsheets, why they ask uncomfortable questions, and also why they constantly worry they're still doing it wrong. This isn't confidence, it's vigilance. They don't outsource peace of mind easily. Because once you've seen authority fail, self-reliance feels like the only defense left. Gen X doesn't manage money to feel smart. They manage it to feel safe. There's a part of the Gen X money mindset we don't talk about enough: the cost. Living in permanent defense mode keeps you alive, but it doesn't always help you grow. When you're trained to expect collapse, you become excellent at protection. You hedge, you buffer, you avoid obvious mistakes. But over time, that caution hardens. Opportunities start to look like threats. Expansion feels reckless. Risk, even calculated risk, triggers hesitation. So Gen X often survives brilliantly while feeling oddly constrained. They hesitate when they should move. They overanalyze when the window is short. They miss upside because safety always speaks louder than possibility. This isn't a flaw. It's what happens when survival becomes the dominant strategy for too long. Because protection preserves what you have, but it rarely creates what you don't. And that tension between safety and expansion is the quiet burden Gen X carries. The real lesson Gen X leaves behind. This is where the story turns. Gen X is not a blueprint to copy. They're a warning system to study. They show us what happens when you trust the system too much, and what happens when you stop trusting it entirely. Blind faith is dangerous, but so is permanent suspicion. The goal was never to live in fear. It was to adapt without shrinking. The deeper lesson Gen X offers isn't about saving more or spending less. It's about design. Designing income that doesn't depend on a single permission slip. Designing savings that create choice, not anxiety. Designing debt that has boundaries and endings. Designing a life that doesn't require blind trust in systems that can change overnight. Because money, at its core, isn't about impressing anyone. It's about buying yourself options before the rules change again. And if studying Gen X's money mindset teaches us anything, it's this. The rules always change. The question is whether your life is built to survive that change or be crushed by it.